Not scream professor, so when I put my glasses on, the professor is in the room. Well, we're very glad to mention Michael Handrick back to Goldsmiths, because you had a reprieve of, what, 10 years when you went around here?
Yeah.
No, bearing a book, Differences Born in the Lips. The subtitle is Reflections on Sexuality, Society and Stigma.
Yep.
A different order.
Stigma.
Where would you like to start? Sexuality, Society or Stigma? You choose the S. Or would you like to read? You'd like to read a passage to give us a flavour.
Should we start with the reading?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for everyone being here, and thank you, Adam, for being in conversation with me. And yeah, it's quite a moment being back here after finishing the MA 10 years ago. So yeah, I'm going to open up with chapter 2, which is about the council estate that I grew up as a kid. And weirdly, the last member of the family left the estate on the weekend, so it was 60 years of family history on this council estate out in the countryside in Berkshire. So it kind of explores kind of the complexities of rural working classness and kind of how that shaped me, and around my gender and sexuality, and wanting to show kind of the positiveness of being working class. And yeah, I think that kind of gives a good intro. Anyway.
So I should have said that. Michael was born in it. That was my job. Sorry.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So, chapter 2. Sorry. The park of my childhood was always divided in two, like one giant game of bulldog. The girls were at one end doing handstands against the garages, others weaving daisies into crowns and sitting coroneted while making nests from freshly cut grass. With matching crimped hair and pedal pushers, they sang the latest pop songs, each one assigned their place in the band according to their looks or personality. I always thought I would be sporty because I could do backflips like her. I wasn't asked to join. The teenagers on the other side played football with their still breaking voices, calling to each other to pass the ball. Topless torsos pearled with sweat. I watched, fascinated, as muscle shifted under skin. I had an urge to be amongst them, to know them, to touch them. I wasn't asked to join. After the game, they sat in the climbing frame passing a cigarette. They were a gang of grazed knees and grass-stained tracksuits, the lingering smell of links mixed in with smoke. They sat, flicking ash from their cigarettes until the streetlights came on. They held them like lollipops if they weren't quite ready to graduate from childhood. The cherry glowed in front of mouths barely grazed with stubble. I picked a dandelion, breathed deeply, and blew the wish-laden seeds onto the night's breeze to plant them somewhere else, somewhere in the future. The park turned the social division that we had been taught was right and normal into a stretch of real space. It was the hub of the estate, where each gang of friends, or family gang as mine was, played until dark. It was the place where our imaginations played out, where boys chased girls to kiss them, where we read the local gossip scrawled in pen under the slide, where arguments were settled with fights. Bulldog was one of the ways conflicts were resolved. It was prearranged. Whoever was the bulldog would know whom they had to catch easily. A coalition was then formed to gang up on the ones who had insulted us. The visible prickling, the chest puff, muscles and sinews taut and ready to pounce. The thud of bodies being slammed on the grass, the sharp gasp as air was forced from their lungs. The cry as a slide punch was given, the cheering, the shrieking, the snarling, the shift of eyes and shimmer of fear when they realized it was a setup. Once it was over, we'd skulk off, licking wounds or peacocking with pride and retribution. From the green sprawled the alleys and the roads where we lived, all named after trees and birds. Even now, I can still remember each one, where they branched and who lived where, ally and foe. It was a route system that we learned to navigate when running away from the man who chased us with an axe after playing Outdoor Run, where we'd need to fly to if there was a fight, or the quickest route home before the streetlights came on. Down those alleys lurked old women who twitched back their net curtains and watched us play. They whispered and wove what we did into their moth-eaten gossip catchers, and stored them there like embroidered prey until they next saw my nan at bingo. This game was their event of the week, held every Tuesday at the hall. My nan, the queen bee, sat in the middle as the other women hovered around her. She'd laugh with a cup of tea in her hand as they told her what trouble we'd been stirring up. Trouble was our gift, as we didn't have much else. We made do with what we had to the limits of our imaginations. We invented a dramatis personae for the characters on the estate, for that's what they were. They weren't of reality. Gummy, who chased us in her slippers, guns moist and shining as she screamed at us. The man who buried children under his back gate. The man who never entered or left the bungalow with the white door and thorn bushes spilling over his garden walls. We played it across the park where our trainers stuck in the rubbery surface, like fingers in warm cookie dough, chasing growing shadows and screams until dark. We used the car bonnet to create a roof for our base, fashioning a rounder's bat out of a shoe. We hunted vampires and cast spells around alley corners. We built rafts, lashing together logs and branches, and tried to sail down the river where the smallest of us was selected as tribute to test whether they'd sink or float. They always sank. During the winter, we slid on tea trays down the icy hill with our scarves caught in the air and in snow flurries, my brother skidding down on his bike and breaking his arm at the bottom. We found pennies on the street, ran to the shop to buy sweets, and sticking out our tongues. A few weeks later, we were barred from the same shop for calling Bab, the owner, kebab. It was a badge of pride when someone was barred from the shop. The ultimate glory was being banned for life. Life, a few weeks, at that time, was endless, like the woods where we ran from dawn to dusk. The main entrance was a cemetery to the estate's junk, a precious place to us that could be plundered for everything. The rusted bike wheels crusted like halves of an orange, left uneaten for too long. Ripped sofas that could be dragged through the thicket and used as a throne in our base. It was the place where we tied string to tree trunks and bent branches to navigate our way through and back safely until we learned the routes as well as the streets we grew up on. We climbed trees and felt dew-tipped moss under our hands to try and see where the treescape finished. It was where the teenagers allegedly had sex in a burned-out car. It was filled with drops of white during spring, then crushed blues and purples when bluebells pushed up between ferns and pines. The shadowed creeks and streams that shone pink, purple, red, like oil and water during sunsets. Mist dripped and draped on branches, light spun like sugar on leafy paths. We turned up home at night covered in mud. I never did find the other side of the woods. However, there was always enough to keep us busy within the estate. Under the froth of apple blossom, the froth of blood from a split lip, the crunch of dried out branches mixed with the snap of bone. There were bleeding nose, chipped teeth, and brawls that happened down alleys or on the green. Doubled over, my mouth wide open. There was no noise and nowhere after I'd been winded from a kick to the stomach. The fist that smashed into my face. I didn't feel it until I was on the floor, staring at the scuffed trainers around me. The howling and the laughter, too sinister for children. The creak of the metal chains on the park swings as they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, as I lay alone on the green with my eye beginning to mottle in red and green and purple. The bruise crawled across my cheek like lichen. Arguments behind netted window, the glint of broken things on the park as the sun set. The flash of a knife as I saw a man being stabbed. The glimmer of blood down the alley that he'd never used as a trail back home. Difference forged us an identity, made us fiercely defensive and proud of where we came from and who we were, despite some of the trouble that went on. If kids from another estate came looking for trouble, we drove them away. The rich kids at our primary school knew not to mess with us twice after calling us skanks. When the police were called because a bin was set on fire or because of a fight or smashed window, there would be a warning echo of police that cascaded down the alleys to warn everyone to play a very real game of hide and seek. No matter the divisions and bullying and anger that threaded its way through the estate, there was an undying loyalty to it and a desire to protect ourselves from the hate we felt from people beyond its borders. We guarded what was precious to us, the smell of pine and bluebells and morning, and the stickiness of resin on palms, thorn-pricked fingers, blackberry-stained lips, and jam jar fishing. On bonfire nights, we'd all huddle together, white breath smoking from mouths, eating barbecue food, licking toffee apple remains from our lips. We ran across the frost-tipped grass, screaming, shadows flickering around us, as the night exploded in colours, stars, and gasps. There was a network of families where parents knew parents, grandparents knew grandparents. They would take us in even if we were locked out or offer a cup of tea despite long-standing feuds. Each street held a place of safety if we needed it. We defended our estate and ourselves fiercely. The estate was a parallel world that gave me a childhood that no one else I've met outside understands. My parents gave us everything we needed. The estate gave us everything we needed. We didn't miss anything. We had open fields where the farmer chased us with a gun, my cousins to hang out with, an orchard where we were pushed over the fence to scrump apples and launch them over for my granddad to catch. This is what we knew, and this is what was normal. We didn't want anything different, we didn't crave more, and didn't know what we didn't have. I'll leave it there.
There's one memoir by a working class man called Damien Bard, which is very strange because it constantly invokes Maggie Thatcher. Maggie and Me is the title. And I thought it was ironic, and then at the end he turns out to be a full-blown Thatcherite who despises the people who stayed where he started, and so he sees being gay as a form of social climbing or social mobility, as an escape hatch. And then there are people like the French writer Edouard Louis, who's written an incredibly opposite book about how loathsome everybody in Piccadilly was and how cruel and vicious, and he couldn't wait to get out. And when he sees people in the education that he goes on to, he thinks, maybe I was just born middle class, because these are pitiful specimens. They're all weak, and it's a very strange perspective. And then in another book, he comes back and defends his background. But you seem anxious not to do either thing, not to allow the push of homosexuality or a gay identity to estrange you from where you started. But that can't have been easy. I mean, to achieve that sort of equilibrium.
No, I think it's been a real journey, and I think I've been chatting to people about it a lot because of the book, and at times it felt easier to kind of erase the working classness and to accept being gay. And it's only really within the past 3 or 4 years where I've kind of felt comfortable to reconcile the two, and that they can coexist, because everything that I grew up with kind of said that these two can't cohabit together, and they can't, working class masculinities versus being gay just don't mesh. And so for a long time I kind of divided myself on that to feel okay in my sexuality. It felt easier to be like, okay, I've left the estate, gone to uni, I've moved on from that and kind of just got rid of it. And it's only kind of recently that I've begun to reconcile the two.
Is your choice of a mixture of memoir and essay form, was this always what you wanted, or did it emerge as the material sort of arranged itself? Are you on the way to a novel? That's another way of putting it.
There is a novel in the works, and there's also another non-fiction book in the works, so I'm keeping my agent busy. I think even at my time at Goldsmiths, I mainly worked in short fiction, short stories, and I think I used them as a way to kind of address in a fictionalized way of a lot of what happened to me when I was young, and kind of trying to understand my sexuality and some of the events that I talk about in the book. And I think it was only, starting to get older and understanding more about, what happened to me in the past, that I felt more comfortable kind of actually doing life writing and memoirs, rather than kind of hiding behind fictionalized versions of what was going on. And I think for me, it was important to do a mix of memoir and kind of essay form, because I love memoir, but a lot of the time I was coming away being like, why did these things happen? And growing up under Section 28, there was so much that there was a vacuum of queer education and validation of who we were. So going into adulthood without any kind of people to look up to or kind of understand what I was going through, I didn't understand kind of why my mental health was being impacted and why I felt the way I was feeling. So I kind of felt it was important to to have the memoir to ground kind of the research that I've done alongside it, to kind of expose the different structural inequalities that impact queer people.
that you use the words trauma and abuse, and consequently the reader, when you start becoming a gymnastics star at the age of about 8, I was waiting for the abuse, because I mean it seemed so obvious, this vulnerability, this hot housing, the enormous amount of pressure. But actually that's not what you mean. As far as I can tell, for you it's a sort of incremental trauma and an abuse without a single agent or even specific agencies, but just an atmospheric abuse that leads to, and it's not a phrase I'd heard before, trauma bonding, where you're somehow sensitized to exactly the things that are wrong for you and tend to seek them out. And perhaps it's the way the book is ordered, but it seems if without that phrase, trauma bonding, and the bells that rang in your mind, you might not have written it.
No, not at all. So yeah, it was a conversation with a friend, one of my best friends, and we were talking about the relationship I had been in, and kind of I'd spoken to her a lot about kind of what had been going on in the relationship, and after it had finished, she said the word, I think, you know, what you had been through was abusive, and I think, you know, it was a term called trauma bonding, which is kind of a cycle of affection and love bombing followed by emotional and psychological abuse, and that, you know, you become bonded to the person. And before she said any of those words, I hadn't, you know, even thought of the word abusive. It felt unhealthy, but, you know, until that point, you know, without having that language and that kind of validation of what I'd gone through, it definitely wouldn't have come about. And so after we had that conversation, I went away and started researching trauma bonding and learning that people who go through a relationship like that normally have some kind of trauma or abuse in their past, which is why I kind of sat down considering, you know, what's happened in my past, you know, what put me on this journey. And exactly like you said, it was, you know, this longitudinal path of, you know, queer people from, you know, before childhood, of, you know, being conditioned into being a boy or a girl, and then, you know, as we said before about Section 28, having this vacuum and, you know, discrimination and prejudice and microaggressions and kind of different parts of society. And that's kind of when I sat down and started to dissect, you know, that it's a longitudinal thing that kind of put me into that situation.
I think some of the mechanisms are familiar. The idea that people with low self-esteem are easy meat for people who manipulate them because they can be made to feel grateful for anything. But that, you know, though that vocabulary didn't speak to you in the way that trauma bonding did. I mean, it's because that description was available to you, but this was what crystallized it as being your experience in a definite way.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I think the only truly shocking sentence of the book lists the distractions, the ways that you've become addicted to side issues and so on, and it mentions writing as one of them. How dare you come back to Goldsmiths and say, I wasted my time doing this and this obsessively, and writing. Surely writing is the way you put yourself.
But it was an obsession. It was, you know, and it's, you know, as so many of us know, writing is a way of processing and of understanding in a different way. And
that's why I thought I thought it was slightly hard, because without that we would not have this.
Yeah, so exactly. And I think sometimes, you know, as many of us can probably relate, it's sometimes easier to write these things than actually speak them aloud. I think it has a different meaning once you sit there and say, you know, this was abusive or this is what happened to me. And I think sometimes writing is an easier pathway to kind of identify that and kind of connect with it.
There was a book I read a couple of years ago. You mentioned there's a bit where you talk about gay ancestors, and I sort of, that's me, I'm a gay ancestor. But I read a book, it Rise Through the Post, and it looked so American. I thought, oh, I don't want to be told how understandable my damage is, how of course I'm a mess. It was called Out of the Shadows. It's about gay men's psychosexual development by somebody called Walt Odets. But one of the things he said, which did strike home, is that the gay generations tend to be quite short because it's a very fast-moving culture. But there's specifically people born in the 50s, like me, who were gay adults and, at least in theory, purged of guilt when AIDS came along, had to reintegrate death and illness and misery into their lives against everything that they'd set out to do. And the people born in the 70s were started to be sexually active in a world where AIDS had always been there. So it was always part of the equation that they factored into. And then gay men born in the 90s, AIDS was there, but it didn't dominate the discourse. That those three generations, born in the 50s, 70s and 90s, would have been very different anyway, but the way AIDS affected them has driven them much further apart and made it seem as if I'm your sort of great-great-great-great-grandfather in terms of gay culture, able to say, oh, I remember when. But does that ring true? I mean,
yeah, for sure. And I've had chats with other ancestors about this. And, can I say that?
Yes, you can. I thought it was fine.
And exactly that. And I was born into the 90s, and the kind of only one of the few associations that, or kind of things that we heard about being gay was if you're gay, you'll get AIDS. And I felt like, exactly you said, we were the generation that was very different to our the previous generations, but that was the only thing that we heard, beyond that's gay, you're gay, blah blah blah. But it was that kind of association and that fear that we inherited in a different way from people before us. That that's if you turn out to be gay, you'll get AIDS. And that was the only association that was kind of presented to us when we did hear about it.
Even though from 1996 AIDS started being less of a centre. Certainly when we come to the Gay Pride Week stuff, and particularly institutional branding of gay friendly, sometimes I think, no, you don't get to do that. NatWest does not tell me how proud it is to have me as a diversity customer.
Yeah.
When in 1988 they insisted, before giving me a mortgage, they had to get a declaration. The reason I had an HIV test, which was negative, was that I was part of a research project, not because I was in any way at risk. And that's obscene. Whereas John Lewis, in my book, when I'm hope that it'll all be sorted, they're allowed to say they have an interest in gay pride, because they used to send along a couple of very nice ladies to Terence Higgins Trust meetings, because they had such a large blood transfusion drive. They had their own van at the one off Oxford Circus, because the National Heart Hospital, which isn't far away, it needs to have fresh blood. It has to be right there. So they would organise convoys of partners from John Lewis to give blood, and they wanted to know, should we stop doing that? Are we, because it's a relatively gay populated workforce, and they wanted to get information, and that's what they needed. So as far as I'm concerned, they get a big rainbow tick, whereas I'm afraid NatWest gets a bit of a black mark. How do you feel about that? About the public acceptability, or the institutional, the corporate acceptability of sex development?
I mean, it's obviously a huge topic, and rainbow washing and riding on it, and the concepts of the pink pound and things like that, and very much in line with you that you can't just put up a rainbow Twitter icon during June and fly a flag without actually doing the work. The structural inequalities and discrimination that queer people still face, as we saw yesterday with the Scottish bill being shot down by the UK government, unless they're actively out there campaigning for us and helping us, then there's a lot to answer for. I think it shouldn't be a trend. It's pride is traditionally been a protest, and that's what it needs to be, rather than getting likes on social media by, you know, putting up a banner, you know, so yeah.
I think you've said that your teachers were legally debarred from talking about sexual diversity, but your English teachers, I mean, you do give them a real shout out as those who recognise your interest and cultivate it. Were they particularly good teachers? Were they?
Yeah, they were fantastic, and you know, coming from an estate where in primary school I was told I'd achieve nothing in life because I came from a council estate, that does something to a child, you know, hearing that when teachers are meant to be there to encourage you and help you learn and you know, shape you as a person. And so going into secondary school, into the local form of grammar school, it was intimidating, and you know, English was, you know, my place of refuge, and you know, books and writing was something I always loved, and I was, you know, incredibly lucky that I had these teachers who recognised that talent and reinforced it, and you know, believed in me, and you know, kind of set me on a completely different course if I hadn't had them, and you know, I'm very grateful for what they've done. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be sat here.
At the same time, from their point of view, a kid who likes to read is always a gift. I mean, if that's the material, it's easy to go with. The kids who don't want to read, they're the ones you're bound to struggle. I have a friend who teaches art at a school near the Dartford Tunnel, and they've all failed the 11th class. And she's brilliant with them, partly because she sounds just the way they do. But she also worked out they're much better at concentrating once she's explained the task if they can't talk. So she plays very loudly music that they don't want to like. So she plays salsa and disco, and she has a glitter ball. And they were brilliant.
I want to be in that club.
Unfortunately, so would I, but I have none of the required talent. You talked. One thing is the way speech gives you away. I mean, that's not the primary meaning of difference is born on the lips, but nevertheless, the way our voices dramatise our status, and I think the phrase code switching is quite a useful one. But I think it's quite a recent idea. In previous generations, I think if you were upwardly mobile, you just systematically obliterated the accent you were born with. My father was a Welsh speaker, born in a small town, but because he wanted to be a lawyer in London, he spoke entirely differently from his brother. And his brother used the word, I've not heard it before, the word far back. Have you heard that? To mean posh. It sounds as if he meant literally the sounds came from far back.
Oh.
But I don't know if that's so, because it wasn't you couldn't ask him. You could say, what do you mean by that? But it was as if he didn't dare be Welsh sounding. He spoke Welsh, it was his first language, but he didn't speak English with any sort of Welsh lilt. But when I heard him speak Welsh, because he married an English woman and I don't have Welsh, he did seem a different person. He seemed much more as if he'd do anything for a laugh, much less the lawyer and then judge that he became. And there was a friend's father who so obliterated his Preston accent that it only came back when in his last illness. So his family suddenly heard this voice they had never heard, because as he became somewhat demented, the later pronunciation fell away. And just imagine that your father is revealed as somebody who's been masquerading all their life long. I think nowadays people do much more of because in my childhood all the accents on radio were like mine. There was no regional accent. You know, the weather was always announced in the same neutral tones. At least, do you feel that there is more permission to have a range of accents?
I think it's definitely getting better, but I definitely feel like there's still a pressure there. I mean, just for an example, I had a work meeting a few months ago, and I was talking, and the country twang came out, and I think I was like, "Oh, she were," or something like that, and everyone laughed because obviously it was so different to how I normally speak. But even just that moment of you know, that kind of how I would have spoken on the estate came out, that people thought that was funny. That shows that it's still not, we're not there. And, you know, speaking to other friends who are like, you know, I feel so much pressure to hide it, because people would think I'm stupid or I'm, you know, working class or things like this. So I still think it's definitely something we still need to work on.
But it's to be expected you would talk differently with your family. I mean, in fact, if you came back and spoke exactly as speaking here, they wouldn't not be very impressed. I think.
Yeah, for a long time I got called the professor. So yeah,
Get some
that was.
That's the way to do it.
So yeah, and you know, going to the grammar school in town and coming back on the estate, everyone would be like, "Oh, you're posh now," and as I say in the book, that they'd ask if we'd have cucumber sandwiches at lunch and tea, and so yeah, there was definitely the divide was showing even in secondary school and coming back and kind of realising that not even consciously I was changing how I was speaking and kind of being the posh one of the estate, which, you know, coming from an estate, it's not.
It's like posh spice, but
yeah.
It's not actually.
But I wanted to be sporty.
I know, but I'm just saying, even posh spice is a relative term.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, one reason I would urge you towards fiction is I get the sense of you sort of slightly tiptoeing around family privacy. And after all, we're very big on ethics at Goldsmith. There's no question of your using material irresponsibly. But you mentioned a brother, but not a name. I do hunger for the exactness. The person who comes over, who's clearly most important, was Steph, who you describe as both twin and cousin, and that her leaving the estate somehow meant that things seemed to, the odds were stacked more against you because she was protective.
Yeah, she was 3 years older than me, and she was a tomboy, and she would beat people up if they boys as well. She can throw a mean punch. So yeah, she really protected me, and you know, there weren't many other people on the estate who liked reading, who, you know, liked writing. We both loved writing since we were kids, so we had that shared common interest, and you know, that there was someone else there like me on the estate. And yeah, once she left, it was kind of, I'm on my own now, without big cousin Steph to beat people up for me. So yeah, which is, you know, something that I explore later in the chapter, how you know, it was fine for her to, you know, wear tracksuit bottoms and beat up boys, but for me to be a talented gymnast was a step too far. So kind of the, you know, the gender paradigms there and kind of what was too far was really interesting to kind of reflect back on.
And one of the insults was Billy Elliot, which is a very strange insult because it's a very popular film, not a demanding one, and the boy isn't gay. Ballet is a great deal more compromising, you'd think, than gymnastics, and yet it still had the power to hurt.
Yeah, I think it was, you know, similar to gymnastics, that they just associated ballet with what girls do and gymnastics by proxy, and you know, girl interest at that point was, you know, coda for being gay. So I think they just put this popular kind of film with that. Yeah.
And so the gymnastics was a phase that you voluntarily abandoned, that it was too hard to keep up the tension of that being such a big activity?
it was a mixed one. It was so age 8 I was asked to move up to the senior squad, where you normally have to be 15 to join, being trained for the Olympics, so I was going up to 5 days a week, and alongside being bullied on the state for it, it just became too much, and I was like, you know, something has to give here, and was hoping that by giving it up that the bullying would stop, and unfortunately it didn't. But yeah, that was how that played out.
But your parents were supportive of that? They were proud of it? Were they disappointed when you stopped?
Yeah, they were, and I kind of, when I was older, I said, you know, why didn't you kind of push me to keep going? And they said, well, you would have resented us and you would have hated it. And they wanted it to be my choice, and you know, there are so many cases in sport of pushy parents and forcing kids to keep going through, and they didn't want to be those parents, and they said it was your choice. But They said it was a shame, and they wish I had, but they understood why.
It is a very drastic fast tracking,
Yeah.
and I think often the wholeness of the child, because you are a child, but you're suddenly being judged by adult standards and treated to a certain extent like an adult. Did you actually enjoy the shift up? Did you enjoy the?
I did, yeah, because it was one of the few things that kind of just took me away from the world, that I could just be somersaulting, and the whole worries of the world would go away, and kind of being challenged in that way of trying to compete with people twice my age was something I relished in.
Like you say, I'm a double minority. I'm left-handed as well as gay, and I'm clumsy, and I live in a world where all the utensils are against me, poorly coordinated. So it seems a shame that somebody who had that should give it up. Do you think we should have some questions? Because issues of class, sexuality, and stigma, the three S's, they're probably. Or would you like to read another piece?
How much time do you have?
20 minutes? What do you feel like?
Another quick reading?
Absolutely.
We can do it, and then get questions. So I'm going to read from chapter 7. Kind of the prelude to this chapter was obviously living on a rural council estate. There wasn't a lot of gay people around, so I found my way through chat rooms, and that was my kind of real first way of connecting with other gay people, and ended up chatting to this guy in Italy for well over a year, and when I turned 18 I bought a very cheap Ryanair ticket and was like, gonna do it in the furthest place possible from the estate. So chapter 7 is me arriving in Italy and finally taking the step to live out being gay. Okay, so chapter 7. Watery pathways filled with red and blue and pink and white light, like lost dreams and wishes, guided us through the city. We weaved through tiny streets where sheets swayed above in the night like ghostly brides, our reflections in the water like the drowned souls of gondoliers, trapped forever in its surface. Masked figures with empty sockets lurked at corners, dealing in love, lust, chances. Will you take the chance? No time to consider, no time to second guess. Love and the night don't wait. They jump from the lips and slip off into the sighs of the water. Empty masks dangled from ribbons, yet to be bought, yet to be assumed. Pay your price, who will you become? Freedom from you, just for a moment, just for the night. Who will you become? You decide. I hadn't realised that a trip to Venice was part of the plan. I was swept up from the airport and bundled into a carriage. Who says that love sweeping you off your feet is only figurative? In a city of disguises, with narrow streets that glinted, where shadows lurked, was there a better city to have found and lost myself in, given where I'd grown up, hiding in the alleys of the estate? We were strangers in the dark, jumping on ferry boats, skipping the fares, not knowing where we'd end up, taking our chances. Roll the dice, the odds are in your favour. We passed under the bridge of sighs, the last place prisoners saw before the bars closed behind them, not knowing the price we'd pay. His hand brushed mine, the green-brown eyes holding mine a little longer than normal. Stolen glances, thoughts unspoken and forgotten. Sighs dropping in the waters, cascading as I felt my heart, all the rivers in me, begin to flow towards him, ready to be imprisoned by that stranger called love. We were there just for another night. A night is long enough for possibilities to be fulfilled, for hidden secrets to be revealed. As the night deepened, we found ourselves deeper in that labyrinth city. We unwound the thread behind us to find our way back, but we'd never find the end again. We asked an elderly lady in a doorway for directions, down back streets and across bridges where gondolas ferried faceless people, lost souls to unknown destinations in the shadows. They carried coins with them for payment. We followed her instructions to the word, her whispers of where to go and which alleys would take us back to the hostel. We stood staring at the brick wall, the dead end the woman had directed us to. We saw her later that night, and she smiled at us and disappeared into the night, into the water. She gave directions, doesn't mean they'll get you the ending you want. That's life. We sat together on a jetty. A wine bottle placed between us, our legs dangling over the edge as stars thrashed in the lagoon's currents. His friend had gone to shower before bed. It was just the first time we'd been alone since I had arrived the day before. As I ate, the waves lapping against the petrified wood, I stole glances of him as he talked, looking out to the horizon. Our fingers grazed as we both reached for the bottle at the same time. "Do you think you'll ever sleep with a man?" he asked, his eyes filled with the shifting dark lagoon. Wine lets the tongue flow and secrets unravel. He stared, waiting for me to reply. I waited for him to kiss me. Take the chance, take the opportunity. "I don't think so," I replied, swigging the wine from the neck. Chance passed. He squeezed my hand and looked at me through his fringe and smiled. The flash of a gap between his two front teeth. The thump of my heart, the flush of my skin from his touch. I was a stranger to love. I didn't need to buy one of the masks the vendors flogged on the street. My heart had always worn a mask hidden in the caverns of my chest. I danced alone in my own masked ball, spinning in mirrored rooms. I wasn't prepared for a stranger to be the one to put it away and lead me in a different type of dance. And I'll leave it there.
Is there a very touching moment in the novel Young Mungo, I don't know if you read that, where one of the characters only realises after his father discovers the chat room payment on the bill, on the phone bill, that his mother knew about it and paid it without a question. His mother, now dead, so it's only in retrospect that he realises that she knew what was going on and didn't make trouble for him. I just thought it was very, very touching to discover that somebody had your back and wasn't going to make a big thing about it, and by definition you never knew about it. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. I'd love to read it so much. I'm interested by what you were saying in reference to you having to shift your voice as you got further away from where you're from, and whether or not you have ever experimented with or think that in the future you might engage with that earlier voice or way of speaking in your text, because when you're reading it's in the sort of, the sort of standard or way that we've been all told that we have to write and speak. So have you ever,
That's actually quite personal because I've just finished the book proposal for the second book, and there are a few sentences where I wrote in the way that I would back home, and my agent flagged it and was like, was this intentional? And I was like, yeah, it was. And it was very strange, one, for me to write it, but also for people to flag it as, you know, this isn't grammatically correct, and kind of that kind of inherent fear as a writer of like, crap, I've made a grammar mistake, or, you know, used the wrong tenses, but, you know, that's how I speak back home. And so yeah, it's something I have tried out, but it is quite scary. I don't know why it's scary, but yeah, it's something that I would like to, but trying to kind of unteach yourself of how you write is quite tricky.
I think it is tricky. The one accent that Terence Stamp can't do is the one he was born with, as far as I can make out. He was a generation that learned how to speak correctly. And when, in a film called The Limey, he's supposed to act like somebody from his background without the voice training, he can't do it. It's buried so deep. It has been, your first instinct has been so thoroughly repressed and obliterated, even when it's done by your own hand, because I think you're saying that you consciously, there's a reward for editing yourself and a penalty for keeping the way you were, and so without anybody actually saying, listen, unless you sound like everybody else, you're not going anywhere, you do internalize it, and you do learn that.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question.
Yeah, I think the voice is fascinating, the way you explained it, and you really made me think. So my children have 3 languages, mine, my husband's, and the language they went to school in, and they used to always get it mixed up, and now they say they think differently and they're different people in each language. And it made me think, when I go home, I speak differently, and it's a gradual process, and I have to almost make myself do it, and I feel different. And I've come to think that it's a consequence of immigration, so you leave home and place and you go to a foreign land or a foreign place, and to return is an act of saying you don't speak, nothing is automatic. You'll always go back as a stranger. And you then have to re-engage in a funny way, and there's always going to be a sense of loss. But I was also intrigued to know whether you ever relate to an audience like us in the language you use at home, at your first home, or would that just feel completely strange? Not just in your writing, but when you speak about anything, would it just feel like not associated with the place where that language is? It's very complex. Sorry, it's very
just trying to think.
It would be a sort of acting performance, wouldn't it? You'd have to find your way back into it.
Yeah.
And rehearse it almost.
I guess like we said earlier, it's just kind of code switching, but it's just kind of natural now because it's the circles that I've moved in for so long, and uni and work and things like that. So, but yeah, there was a part of the book where I talk about going back to the estate and kind of an almost intrinsic shift in how I moved and how I spoke and kind of the things that I talked about, because it didn't feel right being there and kind of having to be more macho or be more working class, and kind of there was a shift in how I was, and I'm not sure if that kind of answers.
It's very poignant because whenever you leave home you lose something.
Yeah.
There are bits when Dennis Potter, the TV playwright, when he's interviewed, where when he talks about his background in the Forest of Dean, his voice goes right back, and particularly the endearment, particularly the male tenderness that comes out, where you remember we'd call each other my butt. They seem to call each other butt the whole time. But there's something about that, the undemonstrative tenderness of speech that doesn't have an equivalent in sort of metropolitan circles.
It's more a comment really, but first of all, thank you so much for your reading. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
But in terms of language, I'm German. I don't speak with an accent. I never did have a German accent actually, because I moved to England when I was 12. But I think that whichever language you don't speak, you then lose a bit of that language. And I think I relate to that very much in your book. And I also picked up this whole issue of language, because what I'm working on also at some point has to do with that. So, in a way, I came to England when I was 12, so my German education stopped. My German language pretty much stopped, because I went to an English school. I spoke German at home, but English, of course, at school. But somebody, a publisher actually, who I met when I was very young, when I was 13 and I had just arrived, at some point said to me, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages of this multicultural, or, I only have to deal with 2 languages, but then I know into more. But Mary, you say your children speak 3 languages. And there is a sort of yearning and a wistfulness about my German. Would I have written in German had I lived in Germany? Of what wasn't and what hasn't been. I'm not as well read in German as I am in English and so on. But I do think it gives you an outsider's perspective. And that, that's what makes us writers. It's incredibly important. And I think you notice things more with a much more close observer. Because, the class system, when I came here, I've never known anything about it. It was insane. You don't even have to speak, you just have to say your name. And that is still as entrenched now as it was when I arrived in 1970. So it's very, it feels good to be an outsider because you can negotiate it much better. So I think that makes your story really interesting.
The only trouble is that if I have a friend who translates from French into English and lives in Paris. So he's losing his English, which he badly needs to translate into. So he makes mistakes and he's quite prickly. But I make myself, I say, Mark, we don't say I stubbed my foot, we say I stubbed my toes. Really? Well, we say, je cogne mon pied. And he even bothered to look it up online to see if I was right. And it turns out Enid Blyton says I stubbed my foot once, but everybody else says I stubbed my foot. The language...
There was a German writer who gave a talk
Isabella?
Yes, and her book was translated, and I said, did you translate your book into German? She said, no, I had it translated, and she said it was like completely different work. I read it and I thought it was so strange, and she said I laughed at completely different bits to the bits in English, so I was very struck by that. I would have to have a translator do it and then go over it, but it's not your voice anymore. That's maybe different. You maybe still have that voice.
But I think, I mean, the healthiest attitude you can grow up with is to feel that you have everything, that you are in every way like your background and in every way unlike it. I mean, so to be structured by rejection is very damaging. To say, I'm not like the people I'm with, you pay a huge price for that, and that is not a price you pay, because you always felt that your parents did more than their best for you, that they were, and that the estate gave you the tools to survive it with. In fact, you, at one point you say that no other background would have given you the tools to survive as well, which in a way it's not something you can know, but the fact that you have that feeling of having been prepared speaks well for the people who brought you up. I think we shall wind things down a bit, if that's okay. Do we need to be out of the room at 6?
No, can I ask?
Of course, you can ask.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about this is a sort of memoir general question in a way, in that given that stuff you're writing about, a lot of stuff you're writing about is difficult, and that you have this, I guess, complicated relationship with your childhood and identity. Did you have a lot of anxieties about publication of? Could you publish bits of memoir before? I think had you in sort of smaller bits, or is this?
No, this the main.
So. I was just wondering, what were your anxieties, and where are you at now in terms of, because you're putting a lot out there.
Yeah, I had a number of anxiety attacks about what I was putting out there. My family didn't know a lot of what I had gone through, and it's something I explore a lot in the book of as being a queer person, of living a double life, and that not talking to them about a lot of stuff. So there was a lot of anxiety about kind of the hurt and the abuse that I'd gone through that they hadn't known, and what I just had to sit them down. That was my biggest fear, was how whether they'd be hurt and upset by what I'd gone through and without knowing it. So yeah, it was quite anxiety inducing. I was lucky to have a very supportive editor, who talked a lot about the process, and my agent is obviously very, very supportive, which helped a lot. Now, to be honest, I don't really care. It's I think the process of writing it really helped me kind of reclaim a lot of what's happened to me, and the point of the book is to help other people understand how society impacts queer people, and I think that helps me as well to kind of to allay those fears of that this is my whole life in a book for everyone to read. But I think it got to the point where it's not my life anymore, it's the book, if that makes sense, and I kind of had to cut myself away from that and be like, I have to be objective with it because it's a piece of literature now. It's there for other people to consume, and I think I had to do a mental check there of, I cried a lot, I had a lot of anxiety attacks, I had a fair few drinks, so yeah, it was very mixed, but I think now it's done. I think a lot of the anxiety was the build up to it, but after publication came out, I was like, it's done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Handrick, for coming to us today. Next week we have a Burns night, so there'll be probably a few drinks there.
Have drinks, and the Pat Cavanaugh Prize to follow that.